All right, welcome to week 9, online introduction to psychology. Today we're going to be talking about memory. So when we talk about memory, we're talking about our ability to uh, create and store information. You can think about this as sort of persistence of learning over time. One thing that we don't often think about is the role that memory plays in our sense of self. Um, you know, who you are, who you think you are, is highly tied to your memory, right? All of your experiences, your family, your cultural experiences, all of this is tied to your ability to remember. Think for a second what your life would be like if you all of a sudden woke up tomorrow and could no longer remember anything that had happened to you. Um, every person that you talk to is a stranger as far as you're concerned. Even family members, even perhaps your significant other. You know, every new task that you're trying to do becomes a challenge, even if you've done it 100 times before. Imagine trying to cook an omelet without ever having memory of cooking an omelet before. We'll talk later on about a person like this in this lecture, and then also one of the options for this week's discussion is listening to a brief bit of radio about a person who lost completely their ability to remember and create new memories. Um, so when we talk about memory, memory is involves sort of a three-stage process. There's encoding, which is you can think of this similar to transduction from when we talked about uh, sensation and perception. Encoding is taking the information and putting it into a language that our memory systems can use. You can think about this in terms of taking external stimuli and turning it into neural impulses. Um, it's similar in that regard. Storage is taking this encoded information and holding on to it over a period of time. And then retrieval is this process of getting information that's stored in memory out of memory. We'll talk about each of these processes today. And it's important to remember that if you have a failure at any of these stages, that means a failure in memory. Most students have experienced this at some point, right? You're trying to remember something that you're studying for a test, and you sit down at the test and you studied it, you know it's stored in your memory, and you're trying to remember it, but you just can't, right? A failure of retrieval. You know it's in there, you remember that you studied it, but you just can't remember the answer. And then that would be a failure of retrieval and thus a failure of memory. So when we talk about encoding, there's two ways that we encode information. We can encode information sort of effortfully and automatically. Effortful encoding is sort of what we're sort of familiar with when it comes to memorizing or trying to put things into memory. This is sort of an active, conscious uh, approach to memory. You're trying to learn something. You can think about conscious repetition as a form of memory. So if I gave you a list of letters, which we will do later on, and I asked you to remember this list of letters, this is effortful encoding. Guy by the name of Hermann Ebbinghaus was really interested in this process of effortful encoding, and he decided that he was going to do an experiment to figure out how this encoding process sort of worked. And so what he did was he put together a list of nonsense words. Now, one of the reasons why he used nonsense words is he didn't want to contaminate his experiment with existing words that he might already have experience with. So he made up these nonsense words. They're pronounceable in that they have a consonant, vowel, consonant, so you can say the word baz, you can say the word fub, j, but these are not real words. And then what he did was he repeated the list until he had learned it. And he varied how often, how many times he repeated the words to himself. He repeated it until he learned it, varied how often he repeated it, and then he tried to remember the list and try to relearn the list the next day. And what he found was that there's a relationship between the amount of repetitions and the amount of time it takes him to relearn the words the next day. The more he repeated the words to himself on day one, the easier it was for him to relearn that list of words on day two. In other words, the fewer repetitions were necessary to remember that list on day two. So, this is the old adage, practice makes perfect. However, one thing that Ebbinghaus noticed with this process of learning, of effortful encoding, was that if he memorized the words very quickly, he also forgot them very quickly. And one of the take-homes that we'll talk about from this lecture is that distributed learning, distributed memory, distributed encoding improves long-term recall. Learning quickly means forgetting quickly. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. I have on here, much better than cramming as you prepare for next week's exam, because in my face-to-face classes, we have exams periodically, and this lecture tends to follow or come right before one of the exams. So there's effortful encoding. We're sort of used to this, but there's also this automatic encoding, right? These are things that we remember that we are not sort of consciously trying to remember, right? What did you have for dinner last night? If I ask you that question, most of you can probably sit there and think of, oh yeah, I had, what did I have? I had enchiladas for dinner last night. I'm not actively trying to remember what I had for dinner last night, but it gets in there, right? This is automatic encoding of information, right? You can think about automatic processing as, the things that your brain is doing without your sort of conscious guidance or awareness. So for example, if you close your eyes right now, you can visualize where people are in the room if you're in a computer lab, for example. Or you can visualize where the items are in your room. You can visualize, exactly where your cup of coffee is if it's first thing in the morning and you drink coffee. You can also think about time. You can think about, you automatically encode your day. What did you do first thing in the morning? What order did you do things? You can automatically encode frequency information. How often did your phone ring today? How often did you check Facebook today? When I give face-to-face lectures, how often did I say, does this make sense? Because that's sort of one of my verbal tics. Many, many things around us are getting processed at this sort of unconscious level. And these unconscious processes are, helping to encode information outside of our conscious awareness. One form of memory that we can talk about is sensory memory. And sensory memory holds on to sensory information for a brief period of time, less than 2 seconds about, right? So, you can think about the priming effects from week 3, or you can think about, a more sort of visceral example. If you've ever played with a sparkler at 4th of July and you sort of swirl the sparkler around in a big circle, you kind of see a trail of light as you swirl that sparkler around. And that trail of light is a function of your sensory memory. Your sensory memory holds onto that light in space for just a brief second. And when you move that sparkler fast enough, right, that trail is that light sitting in your sensory memory for just a second, right? So there are 3 kinds of memory storage we'll talk about. Sensory memory, we've already kind of talked about this sort of short-term, very, very short-term, brief memory. Then there's short-term sort of working memory and long-term memory. So sensory memory is designed to just hold on to information long enough to get that information into working memory, right? Long enough for us to make connections between stimuli, to process information deeper, right? But it's really, really brief, right? You can imagine sort of that trail of light from the sparkler. If if you did that swirl and that trail of light from that sparkler lasted for 30 seconds, even just 30 seconds, everywhere you looked, you saw that circle of light, and then every other bit of light that you saw stayed in your visual field for 30 seconds, you would go crazy, right? So sensory memory just holds on to that information for just long enough for it to be processed into short-term memory. And that's what I just said. So short-term memory, or working memory, is the next step in this storage system. So I'm going to have you guys go ahead and take a brief short-term memory test right now. So what I want you to do is open up the PowerPoint if you haven't done so already. Click on this link here that says take the test here. And what you're going to do is you're going to click start the test. And when you click start the test, the website is going to give you a list of letters. It's going to start with 2 letters, and then you're going to look at the letters, and then when the letters disappear, you have to write them down, right? So don't write them down as they're on the screen, because that defeats the purpose of the test. So just try and hold them in your working memory and then write them down. And then it's going to keep increasing the letters. And what I want you to sort of know, I want you to figure out, what is the maximum amount of letters that you can hold on to? Can you make it all the way to the end and remember all of the letters at the end of the test? Okay, so just go ahead and pause the video, click on that link, take that test, and then come back and we'll kind of talk about what happened. All right, so the question is, I have numbers here, letters. What is the last correct line of numbers or letters that you remembered? Right? What is the largest number of letters that you were able to remember, in that memory test? Typically, when I do this demonstration in class, I find that students, most students can remember on average 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So this can be 7 letters, all the way up to 9 letters. There are some students who can remember 10, some students who can even remember all 12 letters. But most people on average have this short-term memory capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. Short-term memory lasts a little bit longer than sensory memory, about 18 seconds. This assumes that you're not rehearsing the information. Rehearsing is just sort of repeating it to yourself over and over again. In this case, bits of information we talked about were letters. In class, I do numbers. You can think about this application of short-term memory capacity all the time. We oftentimes are trying to remember strings of random numbers. You can think about telephone numbers. Someone says to you, give me a call, here's my number, right? And you enter their number into your phone, but you have to hold that in your short-term memory long enough to get it into your phone. You think about a license plate. You see, someone rear ends you and then drives away. You try to remember their license plate. Phone numbers and license plates reflect this short-term memory capacity, right? Phone numbers tend to be 7 digits long. 10 digits if you include the area code. We'll talk about the area code here in a minute. License plates also tend to be 7 digits long. Right? Now, when we talk about the area code of a phone number, really, an area code, we can kind of think about that as 1 unit of information, right? It's 3 numbers, right? 773, 312. But really, that's like 1 unit of information. You don't need to remember all those numbers by themselves because it's really sort of 1 item. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about our short-term memory capacity is, yes, it's limited to this sort of 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information capacity. But what is a piece of information depends on how we organize information. One way that we can organize is by chunking information into manageable bits. Right? So we can take 21 pieces of information, right? You can think of sort of a string of numbers, and we can organize that into 4 bits of information, right? We can chunk that down into 4 different bits of information. You can think about items like our social security number, for example, right? So a social security number contains 9 individual pieces of information, 9 numbers, right? But what do we do with our social security number? We chunk it into a group of 3, a group of 2, and a group of 4. And then it becomes very easy to remember. It becomes 3 pieces of information, right? So chunking is a really useful way that we can sort of take pieces of information and group them together into a unit, and that can functionally increase our short-term memory capacity. So we talked about sensory, we talked about short-term, we'll talk about long-term memory. So long-term memory is this sort of relatively permanent and limitless storehouse of memory. Long-term memory is, your ability to tell a story about something that happened to you in childhood, or think back to how a neuron works. We talked about that, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, right? That's long-term memory. This is skills and experiences, and it's this third stage of this model. So, we comes into our brain. This gets put into short-term memory. We're paying conscious attention to important things, right? Short-term memory encoded. From short-term memory, then the information gets transferred into long-term memory. And from long-term memory, we can then ideally retrieve that information out. It kind of goes in there, it's away, we don't have to think about it. And if we need that information, right, our memory system can call that up into consciousness and we can use that. Also in this model here, this 3-stage model of memory, we do have unconscious processing that can put information directly into long-term memory, and also can put information directly into short-term memory, not shown here on the model. Now, how does memory work? How does memory work is sort of an interesting question. And to answer this question, I can tell you one thing. Memory does not work like a file cabinet. We sort of tend to think about memory, most people tend to think about memory, if they think about it at all, they think about it the same way that they think about their computer, right? If you are working on a homework assignment or some kind of document, you create a file, you save the file, it goes in your hard drive, and then when you want to look at that file again, you just open it up and then you're looking at that file again. Right? Many people think memory functions kind of like this video recorder. You are video recording your experiences, you save that file. When you want to remember those experiences, you call up that video file and you just sort of re-watch your experience. But what's interesting about long-term memory is that there are no real brain areas that are associated with a particular memory. For example, in contrast, there are, when you talk about sort of the basic units of speech, which we'll talk about when we talk about language and intelligence later on, there are actually particular clusters of neurons in the brain that respond to just this one basic unit of speech. But memory doesn't work like that. Information stored in long-term memory is distributed among different clusters of neurons in the brains. You can think about a memory as sort of a pattern, a unique pattern of activity that's distributed across the brain, not in some specific spot on a hard drive like a file on a computer. Right? And the way that short-term memory actually gets encoded into long-term memory is through physical changes in this distributed clusters of neurons. Literally what is happening is that the connection between neurons gets strengthened when a memory goes from short-term to long-term. The adage is neurons that fire together wire together. So if you recall the biology of a neuron, when two neurons, there's a afferent neuron and an efferent neuron. There's the firing neuron and the receiving neuron. And if you recall the diagram of the terminal button of the sending neuron, right? The terminal button of the sending neuron releases neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, and those neurotransmitters bind lock and key style with receptor sites on the dendrite of the receiving neuron, and this can cause this excitatory response to have this receiving neuron fire its action potential. Well, what happens in the memory system when information is going from short-term to long-term memory is this process called long-term potentiation. So when two neurons are firing together repeatedly, when there's lots of activity between these two neurons, what will happen is the receiving neuron, once it stops receiving input from the sending neuron, will continue to fire its action potentials for a while after. And that continuation is called long-term potentiation. So if you pause me real quick, you've got your PowerPoint open, you can actually click on this link here, and this is a brief visual illustration of what long-term potentiation means. So go ahead and click on that, and you can see what that looks like. So when you watch this video, you can kind of see how the originally firing neuron stopped, and the receiving neuron continued to fire its action potential. It's continued to send its information on down the line, this chain of neurons. And literally what is happening is the dendrite of that receiving neuron is growing closer to the terminal button, physically closer. That synaptic cleft gets smaller and smaller in distance. And this is how memories are solidified. Now, what's interesting about long-term potentiation is if we take some rats and we give them a drug that blocks this process, it prevents long-term potentiation from happening, they have a really hard time remembering a maze. Right, so we put rats, we do memory tests with rats, we give them a maze, they want to find the cheese. If we give them a drug, it makes it very difficult for them to learn this maze. Likewise, if we give them a drug that enhances this process when they are learning the maze, they actually learn it much faster. It enhances memory. So we know that long-term potentiation is a critical feature of how memories get solidified and transferred from short-term memory into long-term memory. Now, the brain structure that is most directly involved in this is the brain structure called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is this sort of roundy-shaped structure. It sits sort of right on top of the brain stem. This area of the brain right here is the thalamus. If you recall from Neuropsych week 2, the thalamus is a sensory hub. So you can imagine the optical nerve is traveling through the brain, and all of its neurons go through the thalamus, and the thalamus is right next to the hippocampus, this structure that is heavily involved in learning and memory. Okay. Without a hippocampus, you literally cannot make new memories. And you might ask yourself, how do you know this? Well, we know this because there's a gentleman who had a terrible, terrible seizure disorder. And the doctors determined that the only way that they could solve his seizure disorder was to remove his hippocampus. They actually removed portions of his amygdala too. And the amygdala is this little nub here that sits in front of the hippocampus. It's involved in emotion, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. But the doctors removed the HM's hippocampus. And this was several years ago, I want to say back in the 1950s about, before scientists really understood the role of the hippocampus in memory. After they removed HM's hippocampus, his seizures stopped. But what they found was that he was unable to make new memories. So he could remember everything that had happened to him up until the point of the surgery, but after that, the only thing he was left with was sensory memory and short-term memory, right? So after about 18, 20 seconds, without sort of elaborative rehearsal, without sort of consciously refreshing his memory, information just disappears from his mind, right? So you can imagine if you walked into his room and met him, you'd say, hello, I'm so-and-so, it's very nice to meet you, and he would have a pleasant conversation with you, and you walked out of his room and you waited 20 seconds, right, which is the average length of time for information to stay in short-term memory. Nothing is getting transferred from short-term to long-term. So when you walk back into that room after 20 or 30 seconds, to HM, he has never met you before, right? He doesn't have any memory of that meeting that you had not 30 seconds ago, right? What's interesting about HM is that he could learn new motor skills, right? So if you think about the game Operation, where you have to use tweezers to pluck little plastic bits out of this sort of image of a man laying out on a table, and you cannot touch the sides. This is a motor skill. It takes some concentration, and it takes some sort of fine motor ability, right? If you were to give HM this task, and you were to give it to him every day for months, he would never remember having actually played this game, but he would get better at the game over time. And so one of the things that a couple of things we learned from HM. Number one, we learned that the hippocampus is critical in this process of creating new memories. We also learned that it's critical for explicit memories, right? So these are knowledge, this is experience. These are verbal kind of memories that we have. Not so important for implicit memories, right? So think about your ability to ride a bike. Like if you've learned how to ride a bike, you know how to do it, but you don't really sort of think about riding a bike. You just kind of do it, right? This form of memory is implicit memory, and it's stored in the cerebellum. It doesn't really involve the hippocampus. It's sort of a more older, evolutionarily older form of memory. Once we've transferred a memory from short-term to long-term memory, then it becomes available for retrieval, assuming that the information gets into our memory, gets transferred from long-term or from short-term to long-term. Now we can go about the process of remembering. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and read this story, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about this in a minute. So earlier I said that memory does not work like a file cabinet. Our current understanding of memory is that remembering is actually an act of recreation. If you imagine that, when you are having an experience, there is sort of a unique pattern of activity in your brain that is unique to that specific experience and those specific circumstances. The idea is that when you are remembering something, your brain is literally reactivating that unique pattern of neurological activity. It is as if you are re-experiencing that event, except that feedback systems in your body are telling you that you're not actually experiencing it. You're sitting at a computer thinking about something, right? But short of those feedback systems, right, your brain is essentially recreating that pattern of activity as if you were actually experiencing it in that moment, right? So for example, if we take a rat and we classically condition, so you guys recall classical conditioning, so we play a tone and we give them a little shock, we play a tone and we give them a little shock, we play a tone and we give them a little shock, right? And if we give them a drug during conditioning, right, if we give them a particular drug when they are experiencing this conditioning, we can actually prevent classical conditioning effects from occurring. Essentially, we can prevent them from forming a memory. Okay. Likewise, so that's kind of interesting. You're like, okay, well, you can prevent a memory from being created if you block neurological systems. That's fine, sure. But what's crazy about this kind of research is that if you take a similar rat and you give them this classical conditioning experience, so tone, shock, tone, shock. So the rat learns and can remember, when I hear a tone, then I experience a shock. And you can demonstrate that they have this memory. And you give them that drug while they are remembering the tone, while they're having that memory. You can actually erase that memory from happening. You can actually erase that rat's conditioned response through the use of this drug. Okay. If you apply the drug while the memory is happening, you can actually erase that memory, at least in terms of rats, right? So there's some crazy implications for this. And this is a relatively new sort of trajectory in research on memory. One thing is that the more often you remember something, the more likely you are to contaminate that memory, right? So again, if you buy this sort of logic that when you are remembering something, you're actually recreating the event in your mind, you're recreating that pattern of neurological activity, then that memory is subject to potential manipulation. It is subject to potential contamination. You can add information when you are having that memory. And when you add that information gets tied to that memory, and then if you recall it later on, that added information might be there, right? And it also brings into possibility this idea that we could potentially erase memories, right? So if we can demonstrate this in rats, that if we give them a drug while they are remembering something, there is the possibility that sometime in the future we could erase memories similar to how they erase memories in the movie The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which if you haven't seen, is a pretty good movie. Okay, so back to the story. Don't rewind and take a look at it. What kind of salad dressing did you order? Right, if you were write it down. What kind of tablecloth, or was the tablecloth red? Okay, write down your answer. What did you order to drink? And then did the hostess or the server give you the menu? So the answers to the questions: the salad dressing was Italian, the tablecloth was white, the wine, you ordered wine to drink, and there was no menu, right? Now, oftentimes when I do this in class, students will remember, oh, it was the hostess who gave me the menu, right? And why do people remember that? Well, because when you go to a restaurant, typically the hostess is the one who seats you, and the hostess is the one who gives you the menus, right? But in the story, it actually doesn't have that information, right? It doesn't say who gave you the menu, right? But your brain is filling in that information for you, right? Even though it didn't happen, when you try to remember that story, your brain fills in that information for you, right? And this has some pretty severe implications for things like eyewitness testimony. So, for example, there's a really great study by a woman named Elizabeth Loftus, who's very interested. A lot of her work is on this eyewitness testimony. And what she did was she brought students into her research lab and she showed them a video of a car crash. And all the students saw the same exact video. Okay. They were run individually, so a person would come in, they'd watch the video, and we'd have lots and lots of these people coming in to watch the video by themselves. And then after the video, she asked them a bunch of questions about the video. And the key question that she asked them was, how fast do you think the car was going when it smashed into the other car? Or, so half of the people got the word smashed. Or she said, how fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the other car? Okay. Now everyone watched the same exact video, right? Everyone witnessed the same exact event. But what she found was the people who were in the smashed condition, who were asked how fast was it going when it smashed, estimated the car's speed as much, much faster than the people who were in the bumped condition. Now everyone saw the same video, but this subtle change in language, smashed versus bumped, influenced their memory, their recall of the event, right? So this is really problematic, especially when it comes to eyewitness testimony, right? So you can imagine that you're a witness to some kind of crime, and you're talking to the police officer, and they say, they say, what kind of, what color was the car that sped away from the scene of the crime? And you're like, well, I think it was a blue car. And the cop says, are you sure it was a red car? And then you start thinking back, like, well, maybe it was a red car. And then later on, they're like, again, what color was that car? Was it a red car? And you're like, yeah, I think it was a red car, right? Every time you remember something, there's the opportunity for misinformation to be added in to that memory. Now, that witness who saw the blue car but then remembers the red car later on, after many times remembering this, they might actually truly believe that what they saw was a red car. Right? So this is really, really problematic when it comes to eyewitness testimony. And now I'll tell you about an even crazier study that highlights this idea that memory is an act of recreation. We can actually implant memories in people, right? So do you remember that hot air balloon ride you took with your family as a kid? Most of you would probably say no. Well, what Wade and colleagues did is they had participants bring them in a bunch of family photos. They got a bunch of family photos, and then what they did was they took one of the family photos and they digitally altered it to take that person's family and put them in this hot air balloon, right, when they were a small child. So you can imagine that the participant is a small child in this photo, right? So, and then they ask them, do you remember this event? And what they find is that people who are shown this photograph of themselves photoshopped into a hot air balloon picture will fabricate a story. They will create a story out of thin air to match this photograph, right? And they will remember that story as if it actually happened to them, right? So even though it actually didn't, right? There's obviously it was created, it's fabricated, right? So memory is sort of a really sort of a slippery kind of thing. It is not black and white. It is not like a video recording, right? It is an act of recreation, and it is very fallible. There's a particular implication for this for the study of repressed memories. So the idea of repressed memory is that you suffer some kind of traumatic event as a child, and then you repress that memory of that event. But then later on, through some kind of therapeutic technique, you can recover this memory, oftentimes using hypnosis. There's a huge controversy over this, and it's not as much of a controversy anymore, but it used to be back in sort of the late 80s, early 90s. Because memory is an act of recreation, these kinds of techniques to recover quote-unquote repressed memories are actually potentially just implanting false memories, right? So if you remember that time, when the whatever happened to you when you were a kid, and you're like, well, I'm not exactly sure, and it's like, well, imagine that scenario. We can try to get you to remember this repressed memory by having you imagine this scenario. And then after you imagine it a couple times, it's like, well, maybe that did actually happen to me back when I was 4, right? There's a huge controversy in psychology. There's not a lot of evidence that supports this idea of repressed memory recovery. And part of the problem with this logic is that typically people who suffer extreme trauma have the opposite problem. It is not that they have trouble remembering what happened to them. It's actually the opposite. It's that they cannot forget. They want desperately to not remember, but that memory bubbles to the surface outside of their control. We'll talk about that when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. So here I have at the end some tips that you can use to improve memory. First, study repeatedly. Remember Hermann Ebbinghaus, right? Space out your study. I always tell students, if you have an exam, it is better to study 5 hours, or if you have 5 hours to study for an exam, it is better to study 1 hour a night, 5 days in a row, than it is to study 5 hours the night before the exam. You want to actively think about the material. So you want to use elaborative rehearsal techniques. It is not just to repeat the information over and over to yourself, but make connections between that information and things that you already know, right? Oh, this idea, that reminds me of this thing that happened to me, or that reminds me of this other thing I learned in this other class, right? Elaboratively rehearse the information. Make it meaningful, right? Make the information meaningful to you. Tie it to, an experience that you had. Make it something about you. Also, you can create retrieval cues, right? So you're tagging information to existing knowledge. And then last, and we kind of talked about this, get a good night's sleep, right? So one of the things that's happening when you are sleeping is that short-term memories are getting transferred into long-term memories. And we talked about this when we talked about sleep, right? So if you take this spacing effect and you study 5 hours, study 1 hour every night for 5 nights and you get a good night's sleep, you are going to remember much, much more for your exam, that you have to take than if you study 5 hours the night before the exam and you are sleep deprived. So that's it for today for memory. As always, let me know if you have any questions. You can shoot me an email or ask questions on the discussion boards.